Hi, everybody. I'm Marianne Mohanraj.
You have lag.
No, somebody.
And I'm Benjamin Rosenbaum, fellow human. And today on the podcast, we have Sogi Ganeshananthan, author of the extraordinary novel Brotherless Night.
You did pretty well with her last name, but
thank you so much for having me on the show.
Oh, thanks, Siggy. We're delighted to have you here for the second time. I think the last time you came on to talk to me about one of my books, and now I'm so thrilled that we get to talk to you about Brotherless Night, which is honestly, like, I don't know, I'm biased, but one of the best books I've read in a decade. So I'm just so excited. The formal bit of intro, he writes as V.V. Ganeshananthan and is the author of the novels Brotherless Night, which is winner of the 2024 Women's Prize for Fiction and the 2024 Carol Shields Prize. It's a New York Times Editor's Choice and NPR Book of the Year, and has just been getting the most glowing reviews everywhere. Also author of Love Marriage, which was longlisted for the Women's Prize and named one of the best books of the year by the Washington Post. Her works appeared in Granta, the New York Times, Best American Non-Required Reading, etc., and so on. I'm going to jump over a whole bunch of other credentials, and she currently teaches in the MFA program at the University of Minnesota, where she's a McKnight Presidential Fellow and Associate Professor of English. She co-hosts the Fiction Nonfiction podcast on Literary Hub, which is about the intersection of literature and the news. Okay. That's the official bio. And the unofficial part is that Siggy and I have known each other since we were wee little tots, because we are both Sri Lankan. Our families are part of the same immigration wave, and grew up going to seeing each other maybe once or twice a year or a couple times a year at kids' birthday parties where the community got together. And then she became a writer. So, and so we have.
You became a writer first.
Well, I'm a little older. So yes, I became a writer first and then she became a writer. And I've just loved watching and reading her work, which we do normally focus on speculative fiction in this podcast. And Sugi's book is mainstream lit. There are no dragons in it. And so no rocket ships. But I really wanted to have her on, not just because I love the book so much, but also because I was hoping she could talk about the process of research that she must have done so much research for this book, which is deeply engaged with the conflict in Sri Lanka. And so I think that is going to be very useful to the writers in our audience, regardless of genre. So that was one of the things I wanted to talk about. And Ben, I don't know if there's anything in particular.
I think it's interesting that you said it's mainstream lit, because it seems to me that it's historical fiction. That's an interesting question, genre question.
Yeah, I guess I would put historical fiction as a subset of mainstream lit, but mainstream is simply being, not having fantastical, not realist fiction, not having fantastical elements. Okay. I guess
it's a very skiffy definition of mainstream, but sure.
Yeah.
Western romance porn is mainstream lit by that definition. Sure. Okay.
Yes. Yes, it is. It's not what it's
just us. It's like the New Yorker the New Yorker magazine map of, like, you've got the boroughs and then you've got a little strip called California and you've got the rest of the world. It's like science fiction and then there's all the other genres in a little.
Well, okay, but I would argue I'm not going to.
It doesn't matter.
But I will say, like, that is. I kind of think of realist fiction as being in some ways a little bit of a blip as a genre category, a sort of recent historical thing, where before that it really was like much of literature had fabulous elements, right? Like had gods and like mythical characters and magic, etc., so on. And anyway, so yes, leaving aside which group is dominant, this is the Speculative Literature Foundation. We usually talk about
Sure.
With...
That's fair. The only reason I bring it up is because I do think that it's interesting that you say we don't usually do this on podcasts, etc. Because for me, having just finished a historical fantasy novel, I was like, there's so much commonality here. You know what I mean? Like in terms of if you want to divide the world into like, does it have dragons? Sure. But if you want to divide the world by like, what is the reader drawn to? What are they interested in? Like, historical fiction and science fiction have in common this fascination with world building. It's like, what is the world? What is the shape of history? What is this place like? How does it work? You know, which is more than just like the interiority of the characters, which this book is all about, you know, has enormous focus on the interiority of the characters, but also very much like what was happening in this historical moment in a way that is, you know, feels similar. It's like an exploit. It's like it conjures a world.
Okay. So
that's all I wanted to say.
Let's let Siggy address. I mean, Siggy, is there anything in here that you'd be interested in addressing or picking up and talking about?
Sure.
Okay.
Well, I will say, first of all, that I jumped in to say you became a writer first in part because I think you were one of my role models in this for so long. I was sort of like, look, writing Akka is doing it. And Thamel, for those who might not know, Akka means older sister and is sometimes an appellation you might use for someone who's not technically related to you. And your family was actually one of the families I knew like a bit better out of that whole constellation of community that was going on there. So first I'll say that. And then I think also like it's worth noting that like as a kid, I never get asked about this, part because I think people don't assume it of me. But I mean, I read a lot of fantasy. I mean, who doesn't? And like, especially when you're younger. And like, I think now I would probably prefer to be reading more fantasy than I am reading, and kind of for work related reasons. And that's not necessarily what my time has gone towards, but I think like it's something that I think very much shaped my understanding of, like for sure, world building. And I think also plot, because I do feel like speculative fiction and science fiction and fantasy all have like a healthy respect for plot. And I knew that as a reader, like as a young person, I had learned so much about plot from like I think probably like one of my first instructors in plot, informally speaking, is like Tamora Pierce. Like I was, I was like, oh, what's going to happen to like the kid who bullies Alana in the first book? He's coming back. And then I was like, oh, I was like, I don't know, like calling the plot. Like if I watch TV, my husband, who doesn't like spoilers, like really, he sort of like is like, could you not say what happened? Because you're kind of
my daughter scolds me now if I start to do that. She's like, "You're gonna make it not fun to watch with you." I'm like, "I'm sorry."
But like for me, that is the fun, right? It's like you're watching a baseball game and you're sitting in the stands and you're like, "I think he's gonna steal. I think he's gonna steal." And then when he steals, you're like, I feel so bad. I feel so goddamn smug, you know? But it's like the right calculation of like, you want it to be surprising, but you also want like, there's some level of predictability and formula that is like also attached to the notion of plot. And like, and that the best fantasy, like, you know, engages with tradition and trope and then also subverts it or comments on it in some way. And I think like those are certainly things that I hope I bring to my like heavily realist, insistently realist fiction. And right, I'm using realism in a certain way in relation to my understanding of Sri Lankan history, which was, I think, heavily shaped initially by propaganda. And I think in the Sri Lankan context, that is like the volume on that is way up. Like a lot of Sri Lankan's understanding of history is shaped by propaganda to a degree that probably not everyone understands. But then for maybe outsiders or people with like just in any way a longer view, it's probably very obvious. I think like my American understanding of history is also shaped by propaganda. So in that case, like I was like using realism and world building in particular, like as a tool against that. Like propaganda says this world was set up in a certain way. And I'm saying like, F you.
And there it does feel like you know, there's something akin to, I mean, I don't think this is quite, it's like there's a mode of science fiction that is all about rigor. That's I think hard science fiction is a word that's been used to the extent that it's become blurred to mean nothing, and sometimes it just is like it's kind of bullshit. But there's a mode of science fiction in which you're like, no, but would this work? Does this make sense? Like, which is a little bit different than I just want to play with the toys. Like, you know, like I just want to have blasters and spaceships and stuff. But if you're like, well, what would happen then? And I think in this book, there's a lot of like that mode of historical engagement where it's sort of like, no, what I'm interested in, what really like, because you find new, fresh things. And you know, even even the characters in the book who are sort of refusing, they're surrounded by overdetermined narratives that they're supposed to pick one or the other of. And the hero Akka in the book is sort of like, no, we're going to say all the things that actually happened. And that has some kinship with like, no, let's actually look, like, let's actually,
and
do the math, as it were.
You trained as a journalist, right? Initially, am I remembering this right?
Yeah, I mean, I think I was a creative writer in the way that like any little kid who messes around is a creative writer. And I was a creative writer before I was a journalist, but then I was published first, certainly as a journalist in any substantial way. So yeah, like I did a lot of interviewing and had a little bit of, I don't know, the mental, like the mindset of like, if there's information out there, I should try to find it. And I should also assume that I can find it. And also sometimes I should assume that any individual storyteller telling me a story is perhaps not telling the whole story, whether that is intentional or unintentional. So I had a lot of maybe practice in holding up two narratives that occur over the same time span and figuring out how they might overlap in ways that the individual tellers might not acknowledge.
Yeah, I don't know if I told you about this. So there was a brief moment where after grad school, where I thought about writing a book set in Sri Lanka, dealing with the war a little bit. And I knew I didn't know nearly enough. So I thought, well, I'll start with doing some interviews. And I did one with this, someone connected me to this person who lived out in the Chicago suburbs, who was Tamil and a supporter of Prabhakaran, and who is the leader of the Tamil Tigers. And I went out and met with him and talked with him for an hour. And he was an ardent supporter, and this would have been 20 years ago, and wanted to tell me in detail about how Prabhakaran, was putting in schools for the children and solar panels on the houses. And I just realized listening to him that this was going to be a very complex story, and that I didn't know enough to like be able to filter what he was saying. And I could have gone on and done the research and learned, and I ended up not working on that book. But it was an interesting moment, a moment of like, oh, like I need to learn a lot about interviewing to do this well, I think. And being able to do that kind of filter, and, knowing that everyone has a biased take on it. Like, I mean, I kind of take that as a given, and maybe, reading too much theory in grad school. I don't know, like, you read some Derrida and then you're like, where is the center? Who knows? So
It cannot hold.
Yeah. But
yeah, I mean, I think that definitely if you talk to people about the conflict, you can find a lot of people who will offer takes like that. And then also there's sort of like, there are a lot of people who are also still offering their individual takes, who are kind of offering things in a little bit more in the middle, or that are not perfectly aligned with one set of politics or another. And so they sometimes have, maybe because they've been less eager to grab the mic, or maybe they were, I don't know, like not comfortable with it in some way. And I think the passage of time has changed some of that. And then I think also like simply, like if you can find those people and ask them, like anyone who has ever been asked, like, how is your life? And like some people get asked that question a lot more than other people. Like I think actually people who don't get asked how their lives are, children and like women and non-binary persons, like anyone from any marginalized identity, like disabled persons, queer persons, like whoever, like people who are kind of at the margins of society in some way or another historically, like tend to have been asked that question less regularly. But like when you ask anyone that question, if they have never been asked before, unless they have like a carefully cultivated practice of like serious interior privacy, like who doesn't want to be seen in that way? I think like I like to be seen in that way. And I think I'm lucky that I think I appreciate seeing others in that way. And some of the journalists that I've admired the most have been people also who have asked other people about their feelings, like not just like like who exactly was on the grassy knoll and where was everyone positioned? But like, like what was, how did it feel to, like, were you scared on the grassy knoll? Like the grassy knoll is a terrible example, but like, you know, like, I don't know, depending on your feelings about the grassy knoll and its existence, like how did it, like, what did you think about it then? What do you think about it now? Right. Like even you as someone who experienced Sri Lankan history in a very specific way that I did not, because I'm younger than you. Right. And also because you specifically emigrated and I was born in the US, like the way that you feel about it now would be different than the way that you felt about it maybe even 10 years ago. And then like the way that you felt about it when you were 13, the way you felt about it in 1983 versus like 1990, like, I don't know. So it's a possible, I don't know. It actually sounds like the interview subject you ended up with was like a little bit more ideologically driven than many other people. And also that you might have asked that question in a time period when someone might have felt obligated to answer it in a way that advocated for one side or another.
Yeah, this would have been somewhere around 2003, 2004. So yeah. And yeah, I think it definitely did feel ideological, as opposed to, you know, like when I talk with my dad about the war, do you call it the war? Do you call it the conflict? I don't know quite.
I could use either. Okay. I think like, right, the war is bracketed particularly by like a kind of officialness that has end dates and start dates. And I think the conflict kind of doesn't. And I certainly don't consider the conflict concluded.
Right.
So yeah, I think sort of before 2009.
Yeah.
To use the phrase "the war" is something I would do.
Yeah. So when I talked to my dad about it, like the way he talked about it, you know, back in, I mean, I only talked about it with him a little back in like the mid 80s, early 90s, you know, was very much about supporting the boys, and people were coming around to the Tamil Sangam events in Connecticut and raising funds to send to the Tigers. And I think at that point he would have been very ideological, rah-rah about it. And then later, as you know, when the Tigers, you know, after the Patriot Act, after they were reclassified by the US government as terrorists, after the news came out about child soldiers and suicide bombers, you know, my dad was very troubled, right? He still kind of believed in the cause, but was troubled by having sent money to support them, right? And was no longer sure it was the right thing to do. So yeah, that's
I did want to say with regard to your earlier thing about having gone to interview this guy, that having known Marianne a long time, one of my reactions reading this book was I was like, oh, this is like like clearly there was a moment when this was a thing, you know, this was an area, this was a kind of book that you know, you were seriously thinking about. So I was sort of like, I wonder if Marianne's reaction is like, oh, good, now I don't have to write it.
A little bit. I mean, one of the things I wanted to ask Sagi about was the process of spending, I think, like 10 years writing this book, something like, and you know, I think reading it, yeah, definitely some of my reaction was, yes, she's done that chunk of the work. Like, it doesn't cover all the work, right? But she's done that piece of the work and I don't have to do it, right? So it is a little bit of a responsibility that nobody was putting on my shoulders, but is now off my shoulders. So that's.
But I remember like 10 or 15 years talking, or I don't know how long, 20 years talking to you about like this sort of, should I, and your feeling of like, I don't know enough, I'm from here, would I, you know, and it's sort of like,
well, it was clear it was going to need a lot of research. And I think that's, you know, this is, okay, I'm going to blank on his name now because I'm forgetting names these days, but I had this conversation with someone in Sri Lanka around that time I was doing the interview, where he was saying to me, you know, you shouldn't be writing about this. You're not a stakeholder in the same way as someone on the ground. No one's going to come knock on your door and in the middle of the night. And I didn't, I'd be curious what Sagi thinks of this. I think my take on it at the time was, I wasn't a stakeholder in the same way. I was writing from a place of relative safety and privilege. I think it would have been fine for me to write about it, but it made me realize I would need to do a lot of research and work to be confident that I was writing responsibly about it, if that makes sense. So let me throw all of that mess to you, Siggy. Any piece that you want to pick up as a thread?
Sure. Well, I worked on the book off and on for 18 years. And if you condense all the time when I wasn't working on it, maybe it gets down to 10. So I was like 24 when I started it, and I was 42 when I finished. And I was a very different person at the end of that than I was at the beginning. And also at the beginning, I wasn't, like, it's not like you sit down and you're like, I think I'll spend the next 20 years of my life on this project. That seems like a logical gamble. That seems like like who does that? No one does that. I certainly didn't do that, right? Like any working writer who is like, I would like to have a sustainable career is like, I'd like to publish a book somewhere between every 2 to 5 years, depending on my personal work cycle. And that's probably the majority of writers. And I think at that time, I hoped to be one of those people, and it turned out I wasn't, which was kind of a bummer. So
Preach.
like, I think, I mean, I think like, right, like
Ben, and I don't think if you know this, Siggy, but Ben recently published his first novel, and it took him a while to write that, right?
I think at least 12 years. I mean, if you count everything.
Yeah.
And congratulations. I feel like one of the things about first novels is that like, you don't get asked about your timeline in the same way, because your timeline was like invisible and private. And like, when you started working on it, like no one was like, well, Ben, what novel are you working on now?
Right.
Or I don't know if they were like, maybe in this, not at the same volume, or like so there's less pressure on your timeline. And like, I had published a first novel that I felt different, like that I love and I'm proud of, but it like felt differently about. And then people were like, what are you working on? And I was like, do you have to lean forward and say it in that slightly like pressuring way? So
we have to come up with a better question. Like, I hope you're writing something fun. Are you enjoying being a writer?
That could also be pressure. I don't know.
I know. Yeah, I can't think of what a good one would be.
I think it's the leaning forward. I don't think what are you working on is the problem. I think it's what are you working on? Like, it's the intensity. I don't know. I managed to dodge this by always writing in a different medium every time. Like, I just,
I was like, I think it's so smart. It's so smart. Like, just turn, it's like, well, I worked on a novel and now I'm writing my first, like, if every time you wrote something, it was the first time you did X.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that's what I've done so far, pretty much.
Yeah. I think it's such a good strategy. And like, to make clear my like status as a complete hypocrite, like I 100% ask people what they're working on now. Like when I interview people, like, it's a standard question. Like, if you're like trying to end a conversation with like a magic 8-ball question, or like like I'm like, what do you forecast for this current event, or what are you working on now, or right? And you can kind of take your pick, but it's a little bit of a shit show. Like, like, so anyway, like I worked on this book for a long time, and I think I benefited from the hubris of being 24 and like not totally grasping the amount of work that would be necessary. I benefited from being like an extraordinarily stubborn person who had also, like Marianne, been told by various people like, maybe you shouldn't do this. And I was like, now you've made it. Now I will do it.
Now I have to do it.
Yeah. Like you essentially have been like, well, like sit down, little girl. And I was like, no, definitely not. Like that just, I mean, I don't know. I don't immediately have a reaction. Like if someone says that to me, I'll kind of smile and nod. Like my inner contrarian does stay on the inside. And then she, I don't know, puts her nose to the grindstone for 20 years just to show people that they were wrong, which is like sort of like a petty motivation. And also,
hey, whatever energy source you can draw on, I feel like is legit.
That was sort of like,
the proof is in the pudding. You did
at
show
some
them
point.
wrong.
Yeah, I mean, like, I don't know. At some point, partway through, a writer who you and I both know, Marianne, who is also Sri Lankan origin, said something to me like, revenge is a fine motivation. And I was like,
that's great.
Glad to hear that, because
well channeled.
Yeah.
It's a good place to put your thirst for revenge.
Yeah.
So I think at a certain point I was like, well, whatever gets me through. And I was fortunate to have like the support of a lot of people with different skills, like scholars of that history. So I also had the time to, I'm trying to think of like the good metaphor, like dip my pen into a lot of different inkwells, like stick my fingers into a lot of different pies. I sort of read a lot of anthropology and history, and of course journalistic accounts and memoirs, and all of that was kind of playing against the interviews and also against like the cocktail of the subconscious, where like all of that is sloshing around to make like things that you invent. And so there are key moments in the book where certain plot things happen. Like I spent a long time, for those listeners who might, and why should they, like might know nothing about this book, like, right, it starts in a first person point of view in 2009, the year that the Sri Lankan Civil War ends, and a Tamil woman living in New York is remembering her teenage years, starting in 1981, when she's like, I would love to go to med school, and going through more or less like 1989, and then jumps forward towards the end of the war. So it's really about kind of the first maybe like third of the war. And she, oh dear, where did the train of my thought go? Oh, this is now happening. It's so fun.
I know.
But like,
she gets wrapped up in things.
She gets,
she gets drawn in. Yeah.
Yeah, she has, she's the fourth of 5 children. She has 4 brothers. And so she has a particular feminist perspective and woman's perspective on everything that is unfolding. Men that she knows and cares about get wrapped up in violence in certain ways, whether they're subjected to it or participate in it more actively themselves. And like sort of this whole period of time, right? Like I was a little kid in the US. Like what did I know about this time? But I had sort of been told a lot of stories about it. And then kind of as I was referring to before, like mentioned, like sort of came to realize that the stories I had heard were not complete. And so it was like motivated also just kind of to do the little bit of detective work of like, I don't know, if I were from France, like maybe I would know the history of France. And being sort of annoyed by that, and like, looking for a way that stories that in another context might have been very easy to find, like excavating them a little bit. So and I think like medicine was also a thing that ended up being like a driver of the book in a way that I hadn't totally anticipated. But Marianne's father is a physician. My father is a physician. Like part of what brought the community that we grew up in together, what brought that community together was that like many of them had been what we would call batchmates or classmates, had gone to some kind of professional school together. And so like the language of like, oh, like how did that patient present? Like how would we characterize the wound? Like even sort of
that's
listening.
the dinner table conversation that we grew up with, right? So my dad would come back and tell stories about what he saw at the hospital that day. I was thinking about the medicine piece of this. I think is really it really works morally, if I'm going to say that, because you set up this question of various the conflict is raging, various of her siblings and a young man she knows are getting caught up with the tigers, and then they're I feel like it's a spoiler. I kind of want to avoid spoilers, but there comes like this question of like, is it are you supporting them? In what ways are you supporting them or getting involved with them if you use your medical training to help them, right? And I think it's such an interesting place for you to put your protagonist, because you don't have her like running out to shoot people, right? But she is having to confront the moral question regardless, right? Does that make sense? Am I framing this well?
Yeah.
It's a book that has somehow a Hippocratic morality in its bones. Like there's like what she's really just like, I must feel this now in lots of different situations.
Yeah, but it's a hard question, right? Like if you are a healer for soldiers, right? And if they then get up and go out and start shooting people again, right? Do you have a piece of that responsibility then, right? I think is interesting.
But there's a way in which there's something there's something anti-ideological about her stance, like that kind of utilitarian thinking, like, oh, if I help this person, that will,
right.
like
The book resists that. Yeah, no.
The thing that she sets herself against is the kind of runaway utilitarian thinking where you think this side is bad, therefore if somebody organizes a soccer game with that side, that's bad and we should eliminate that. You know what I mean? It's sort of like the sort of absolute utilitarian, like all things are the whereas she's very much like, this person is in front of me, they are hurt, like we're not going to follow the chain of events of like, if I help them versus don't help them, what will they then do, blah blah blah. Like we're just in the now. I'm going to do what's this is what I have control of right now. And it's also sort of like, I'm seeing the full humanity of this person as opposed to reducing them to like an agent in a chess game where they're going to push things in one direction or another, and therefore helping them adds points to this side of the balance beam. It's like, it's much more interesting to me that they're like a person with a family than that their future actions might like tip the scale one way or another.
Yeah. And I think as much as, I don't know, being a part of this community of children of physicians and other professionals like was an influence on my understanding of medicine. Also, just like as a kid, I watched a lot of I was watching, ER or Grey's Anatomy, and there would be the patient who would come in and like you would know that this patient had perhaps sexually assaulted a minor, and like then the doctors would like there would be some doctor, like young hot-headed doctor, who would be like, I'm not treating this piece of garbage, and then someone else sort of senior and wiser who would be like, that is our obligation, he's a patient like any other, and like there would be some sort of like, I might be reciting a scene from ER right now, right, like
totally.
like or like
and from Grey's, I mean, and from all those things, right?
Like the patient who's like has a beard, and then his friends are like, shave it, and then like they shave it and it's like there are swastikas underneath or something, right? Like and then or like anyway, so like it also was like clear to me that, and then sort of like going and thinking about those scenes and how they worked and realizing like that is actually like those arguments were like not the least realistic things that were happening on those shows, that those were predicaments in which one might find oneself. And then actually the way the profession works, the answer is fairly obvious. Like you're like, if someone were hurt in front of you and you were a person with medical training and you didn't do anything, you would actually be violating your oath. As a fun piece of trivia, at one point this book was called Hippocrates, and then I realized that a lot of people did not know how to say Hippocrates. And I was like, I'm going to say that for my children's book about hippos and crates.
Nice. I love that.
Hippos and crates. Hippos practicing medicine while standing on crates. I feel like that's the children's book angle here. That's
so someone called children's book publishers don't all rush to call me immediately.
That's right. Rush in. I mean, it's an amazing title. I just want to say, like that. The title is tremendous, and particularly the moment in the book where the phrase occurs. The fact that it's the title heightens the moment too. I think.
We're talking about the Brotherless Night title, not the
Brotherless Night, not the not Hippo Crates. Hippos on Crates, also a good title that may have a moment in the book. I don't know, but Brotherless Night. One of the things about that is the way in which sibling relationships are so central in the book, and in a way that I think is kind of often sidelined in like white American culture. Do you know what I mean? Like it's sort of like there's so much attention to like parents and children relationships and to romantic relationships and everything, which are in the book, but like the siblings are sort of really central. And as you point out, the metaphorical siblings, right? Like her mentor, who she calls Akka. But that the model of siblinghood, that like the person who really takes care of you as a brother or a sister, is really striking, and sort of central.
Yeah, I also want to note about the title, to go back to what you said at the beginning about plot. You give us the title Brotherless Night, and then you introduce us to this girl with 4 brothers. And the title has plot in it, right? Which I think is kind of amazing, right? Because you are now immediately like, well, how do you get from having 4 brothers to brotherless, right? Is now going to be driving you through the whole book. Which I don't know that I've ever seen a title with plot in quite the same way. I'm sure someone's done it, but it's a kind of a claustrophobic book, because you know that terrible things are coming, right? And and yet it's so beautifully written and so compelling, and there's so many small lovely moments of, like studying or whatever else that it doesn't feel like I could keep reading. Like I didn't have to put it down. Like there's some nonfiction things and whatever that I'm like, I need a break from this. I can't like keep doing this. And this I thought the balance of this was really, really effective. Can we talk a little about the teacher figure? So this is Anjali Premachandran is the character in your book, right? And she's based on a real person, right? Rajni Thiranagama, I'm saying that right. Can you maybe just talk a little about how that wove its way into your book, how her story
Sure. So I started writing this book when I was doing research for my first book and came upon a story about a historical event that I knew I couldn't shoehorn in there. I'm generally not of the mind that I should save things for later, but in this case, it was very obvious that I could not, my first novel, Love Marriage, could not suddenly feature a Tamil militant on hunger strike. And so it's the thing that kind of takes over a book. And so I was like, put that one in the drawer. And then I went back to it, and I had around the same time, in relation to that, become fascinated with the figure of Dr. Thiranagama, who is the author of, I usually wrap this book in bubble wrap, which maybe I should do again. Anyway, it's a rare book. It's called The Broken Palmyra. And it's by 4 Tamil professors who worked at the University of Jaffna and who had no formal training in human rights documentation as we understand it today, and who decided to document what was happening to their community. She was one of the 4 of them. And she was the one that the Tigers assassinated. So she has a section of the book that's specifically about women. She was a beautiful writer. It's possible to be with her voice in a certain way because she left behind a lot of writing. And so she was one of the people I was interested in writing about. And then there was a period of time when, so I was writing about this hunger fast, and I thought, I don't really want to write about it from the point of view of the hunger striker, because I can't really get in his head. And I think that if I can't get in his head to this extent, then maybe I don't actually want to. So I invented the figure of Sashi, and then eventually learned that it's like, oh, medical students were present for this fast. The fast that it was based on. And then I think she was the most famous female figure of the Faculty of Medicine at the University of Jaffna's of that history. She was the most famous woman associated with it. For a long time, I think she was kind of the only woman associated with that faculty. So she was kind of an obvious figure to attach to. And I was really interested in her anyway, as someone who had been a supporter of the Tigers and then had been brave enough to criticize them and had paid the price. She was, for me, I think in history, a role model, of course. And then, for a while I was like, maybe Sashi is also based on her. And then there was one brief moment where I was like, I had a woman character who ended up being basically Sashi doing the autopsy of a character who then ended up being her assassin. That was the moment when I was writing science fiction, because it was right. I was like, oh no, this is like a a time paradox. I can't do your assassin's autopsy. Right? And it's like, and I was like, oh shit, how do I get out of this? And I was like, oh, it's 2 characters. I'm going to do the swift solution, which is I'm just going to split you in 2. And then it turned out they had kind of been 2 all along, because I was interested in a student-teacher relationship, right? Rajni Thiranagama had a lot of women students, and was an akka figure, I think, to a lot of women who were students, not students, etc. In that time. So I have frequently met women who lived through that time period who would say, oh yeah, I knew Rajni Akka. Like I lived down the road from her, or I was in her class, or like, you know, I was in a study group with her. I was in a theater group with her. And so I couldn't undo history. And my particular, and I did not end up writing something with like a logical conundrum in it. I just ended up dividing them in two. And then there are some small references to her and her history in Love Marriage, which you could only kind of catch as Easter eggs if you knew that history. But yeah, and here she was kind of more fully fleshed as a person. I was interested in where like she was a person who resisted like kind of notions of martyrdom as the Tigers presented them. And then to some people cast her as a martyr or as a kind of saint. And then I did hear like people who knew her kind of resisting that notion also, like she was an ordinary person, like she supported other ordinary people. Other ordinary people also were killed in this. So she was extraordinary, and also so many other people were also extraordinary. And so yeah, thinking about like the ways that my own teachers had been influential in paying tribute to that in the figure of Rajani. And then there's actually another historical figure, actually maybe the only one who really explicitly appears in both books. A man named C.E. Anandaraja was the principal of St. John's College in Jaffna. And he organized a cricket match between the St. John's cricket team and the Army cricket team. So the question of spoilers is always so weird. Yeah, I mean, for people who like, I don't know, like, did JFK get assassinated? Like it's weird because like I think in some cases, right, for people who are like, this is a less mainstream history, and so there are major historical events where Sri Lankans get to like July 1983, and if they're Tamil, they're like they 100% know what is coming, and like someone else is reading and they have no idea.
Yeah.
So like the spoiler alert is real weird. But anyway, C.E. Anandaraja appears in both books. And was a figure I grew up hearing about. And like he might actually be the only person who like explicitly appears, like that cricket thing appears in both books, because I grew up sort of being like, are you kidding? That the consequences of doing this were this. So I think maybe he's the person who appears in everything. I guess we'll see. But I think that yeah, like as a line of teachers, going from a version of him to a version of Rajani Thiranagama, and characters who hopefully both became themselves as well outside of like the historical facts and parameters was important to me.
Thank you. It's interesting for me thinking about this just because I don't tend to write about, real people, right? So I might use somebody in my life as a sort of jumping off point for a story, but then it's not trying to represent their actual life at all. And these are fictionalized. I mean, they're, you give them different names and, but it's an interesting question. And I think in genre, I'm right now sort of thinking loosely about doing some stuff based on Sri Lankan and Indian historical figures, but like way back, like 5th century. And so there's no living people who are going to be upset about their relative being misrepresented, right? And so it's just a trickier area that you work in, I think, when you do that. And I just found it interesting. And maybe that's a good transition to, I kind of want to ask both you and Ben about this. I've kind of skated around the edges of writing about ethnic conflict. I do, but in a science fictional, etc. way, and mostly focusing on other aspects of it than directly the conflict itself. And I know Ben and I have talked about Israel, Palestine, the conflict that's happening right now, and on the podcast we had a conversation about that a while back. And I'm curious if you could both maybe talk about like does it make you anxious? How do you navigate that? Knowing that people are going to have strong emotional reactions, and and feel like you are just wrong about things because they are convinced of them. I don't know. I'm throwing those thoughts out there.
Dan, why don't you go first?
Well, I mean, it's funny that you say that, because of course I haven't actually written that much fiction that's directly about Israel Palestine. I mean, I wrote The City of Peace, which is like a 400-word epic fantasy history of Jerusalem, which I don't know, I stand by. But but of course the ethnic conflict I was really writing about recently at great lengths, I just realized I measured today, and it's past. It's more words than the Lord of the Rings trilogy. Is The Ghost and the Golem, which is, of course, about the pogroms of 1881. So that's really like the massacres in the Russian Empire of the Jews. It is kind of the root of some of the modern, you know what I mean? Like there's a through line historically, but it is, of course, like just sort of right at the beginning of that. It is funny that, so it just came out. It's just launched, and it has been funny to, like, it's really not I mean, it's both. There was a post on Reddit that said, this is an amazing interactive novel that's with a terrible publishing date. Like, poor Ben Rosenbaum published this in the middle of both the Ukraine war and the Israel war. So, like, what a terrible time to release a book like this, because everybody will be reading it through those lenses and have these reactions. And it was not like there was nobody, because there were people on Reddit who were like, there's somebody on Reddit who was literally like, a book about Jews and Russians? That's spicy for right now. And I was like, wow, okay, thanks. But I sort of feel in some ways it's a perfect time to talk about it. Like, it works on two levels. Like, this is a group which is marginalized and oppressed and, being massacred, which is, like what's happening to Palestine right now. And also it's the roots of, like, it is also connected to why, like, on the one hand, if you're getting genocided and the shit bombed out of you, like, it doesn't particularly matter what the motives of the people doing that are. But on the other hand, it's also the case that, like, it is kind of interesting to look at the cycle, right? Like, it is there, that in fact it's generational trauma behind it that comes from, that has some legit roots. So it's kind of like, it's both. I feel like it both talks about the antecedents of it while also kind of mirroring in some ways the rest of it. Anyway, but I don't know. I sort of feel like I don't know. There was like one person also on Reddit who was like, well, I found his post on Israel Palestine, and it's very both sidesy, so I'm not going to read his book. And I was like, okay, that's that is legit. That is one reader lost. I perhaps wish you'd read the post a little more carefully, but fair enough. But I found it, I used to be really afraid of writing historical fiction because I felt like it was a lot of work and I would get it wrong, and I wouldn't have, there was just like an insurmountable amount of research and I would get things wrong. And I have ended up finding it energizing. And it's kind of like what I was saying before about the connection with science fiction. It's like when I was writing about a far future world and there's like 1 trillion people living on this planet, and I had to be like, what would that actually work like? How could you get 1 trillion people to live on a planet? How does the math work out? Like, that leads you to lots of interesting places you wouldn't have thought of otherwise. And it's kind of the same when you go and look at, like, they actually couldn't have a wedding in May of 1881 because it's the counting of the Omer. And so that's like not a time you have weddings except for this one day. But if that's the day that this happens, then the market is 3 days before. And would the Christians have been coming to the market on Sunday? Like, the fact that you have to do this like math and juggling leads you to more interesting places. It leads you to sort of like, you're confronted with this actual, suchness of it where you have to look at it and you're like, so you're not just in the regular grooves of it, And to bring it back to Brotherless Night, one of the things that I thought was so effective, you were talking about the pacing of the bad stuff, that there's like wonderful moments on bicycles and like feelings of crush, people having crushes and excitement about medicine interleaved with like the growing war. And part of what's interesting is the sort of slowness, like the fact that it builds and the fact that people keep saying, as they do in such situations, well, it can't get worse, right? Like we can't, like, well, they've already done this. They're not going to do more. You know what I mean? Like, it's sort of like all these moments where, like, first the dad is like, I don't think, you know, he doesn't come home because he doesn't think, you know, and then the mom is like, oh, but once this happens, we'll be fine. You know, and they just keep being these, the mom is like, the Indians will intervene and that'll help. You know what I mean? And so there's just keeps being this level where you're acclimated to a certain level of normality. And as things get worse, it's even though you've been through all the other levels of escalation, it's hard to credit that it will get even worse. And that also creates all this, you know, it's not just flattened. I think if you're writing, I imagine, maybe this is a question for Suki, but I imagine if you go to write this and you don't look at the history, it would kind of be black and white. You'd be like, and then the bad thing happened. And the fact that you have to think about the details of how it escalates from, you know, moment to moment, and what people were afraid of at this time is different from what they're afraid of a year later, that gives it a kind of richness.
I think I'm so interested in your explanation of, like, you couldn't have a wedding at this time except for on this date, but then if you did it on this date, then, right, like, those are exactly the kind of things that, like, you know, it's like I was like, okay, I really want Sashi to be in Colombo for the 1983 anti-Tamil pogroms that took place at that date. And then I was like, how would I get her there? But then if I did this, it would have this consequence, right? So essentially you're like trying to play chess like 5 moves ahead. And then sometimes you fail, you like write something and then you end up with someone doing their assassin's autopsy and you're like,
right, exactly.
And so, like, I think in the end, like, the way that things actually happened was a guide to plausibility. And, like, on the rare occasions that not the rare occasions, but, like, when I did invent something, I often found that I had marinated myself so thoroughly in, like, the general way that things had happened that I had often invented a thing that had occurred.
Like,
like,
sure.
Like Sashi being a medical student watching a hunger strike, like, the way that she actually ultimately ends up in Colombo in 1983, like, that happened to someone, but I only found that out after I did, like, a meticulous amount of plausibility research about, like, I'm like, how would this, and then I, like, would call my dad and he'd be like, okay, that can happen. And you know, I'd run it by like 2 or 3 other people. And then I found it in the foreword of a history book that I was reading. And I was like, I could have saved hours of my life by just basing it on this thing that actually happened to someone. So, like, I mean, one of the reasons that people are reluctant to do research and that write what you know is, like, this common phrase, I think, and I'm sure that I'm borrowing this from someone else, but I have no idea who, but just simply, like, right, the kind of research I did that was not based on my own life is much more work than, like, simply writing from something that has happened to you. And on some level, you're doing both of those things for the same reason as a component, like, that, you know, it's plausible. And so, like, that's an argument you can dispense with. But, like, I was arguing for the plausibility of things that I knew had happened that people had intentionally tried to erase. And I had been told not to do it. So I, like, right. So I had this, like,
so you had to go there.
Yeah, I had this other motivation of, and I think that it's, like, in some ways, right, like, the kind of question of how is your writing connected to your own life is more complex than people kind of imagine it as, like, very biographical, faxy, like, oh, Ben wrote a character who like, did you go to the Duke Ellington School of the Arts?
My daughter did.
Oh, okay. So, like, you know, if you wrote a character that, like, went to the Duke Ellington School of the Arts, and for listeners who might not be looking at a visual of Ben, like, he's wearing a t-shirt that says Duke Ellington School of the Arts, which is in DC, which I know because I'm from DC. Right. Like, and so if you made a reference to that, people would be like, oh, Ben's writing about his daughter. And, like, and, like, actually, maybe you would be writing about a character who was similar to, like, your next door neighbor as a child who went to a different school of the arts. Right. Like every time, like, I have a cadaver, like, there are cadavers in this book. There were cadavers in my first book. And people are always like, did you go to medical school? And I'm like, no, when I was 17, my science teacher took me on a field trip to Georgetown University where I saw a cadaver. All of my cadavers are that guy. They're all that guy.
Yeah, they're all that guy. I think that's interesting about the 2 things. One is the distance. Like, there was a point, I live in Switzerland at Basel, and there was a point where I was writing about, like, sort of future Europe in 50 years, whatever. And I intentionally didn't set it in Basel. I set it in Frankfurt because Frankfurt is close enough that I get it. Like, if I'd said it in, Ljubljana, I'd be pulling stuff out of my ass and I'd probably be wrong. Like, it would take a level of research. I wouldn't have the feel of it, but I get enough of Frank, I can read German, I could fact check things myself. You know what I mean? I could go there. I've been to Frankfurt. I have an impression. I have a gestalt of what the city feels like. But if I'd written it in Basel, I would have been so caught up in all the actual details, right? I would have been my brain would have been overwhelmed by like, but on that street, it's over there and you have to make a left turn. You know what I mean? Like, it would have been washed out. And Frankfurt's the right amount distant where I don't really know it well enough. So it's like in my imaginarium. You know what I mean? It's sort of like I have an imaginary Frankfurt, which is close enough to real Frankfurt that I could do the fact checking, but there's so much room there that I can make up things. And in a way, it's like the cadaver, like somebody who saw a cadaver once when they were 17 and it was like a bit like it's stuck in their mind. That's almost more fertile than somebody who is coming home from doing autopsies every day and trying to write. You know what I mean? Like, it's like that's probably not in the same, it doesn't have the same resonance as something that's got room around it. But the other thing I wanted to say is that I love what you said about marinating. And to some extent, this podcast is often like one of our audiences sort of young writers, trying to fit, like advice. There's an advice for young writers track. And I think for people who are intimidated by historical research, the way that I think the interesting thing is I sort of thought, well, I would pick a project and I'd be starting from zero and I'd have to like just from nothing generate this enormous amount of historical knowledge, and it seems insurmountable. Like if you look at, but in fact, what happened is that you get, and I'm not sure if this happened because you've been writing a book for 18 years, so maybe this, but to some extent, I think what happened with me is I got kind of fascinated with certain period, and I kept coming back to it in different ways, and I kept reading things from it. And by the time I was actually writing this magnum opus, like I already had marinated enough that it was like, sure, I was still tracking things down, but like it wasn't this enormous heavy lift I had to do all at once. It was like I had gradually accumulated like muscle memory of like what things would feel like there. And so I could, as you say, like then my guesses or my imagination often ended up being in the track of something like you said, like where it's like, oh, I invented this, but actually it did happen, because it's like enough clues, one enormous mountain, which like go do all the research. It was more like, aggregated over time to the point where it got easy and more fun and just became like, I mean, if you're researching like I'm not drawing periods that involve genocide, but also that are involve, delicious things to eat and, young love and walks in the park, right? Like both things are true. Anyway,
I think that's all really well put about the clues accumulating.
Yeah. The earlier bit that you were saying about Frankfurt being like the right level of distance, it reminded me of, at one point I was writing a scene where someone had to do essentially kind of like battlefield triage, right? And it was a young med student. She had her hands in somebody's guts and was trying to like figure out, what am I supposed to do here?
I remember this scene.
Yeah, and I wrote to a doctor friend, because I have many doctor friends, and said, can you tell me whether I've gotten this right? Like what would be actually happening here, so on. And the dear sweet man sent me back 2 detailed pages of like medical description of what you would be doing in that thing, like like he's an expert and he knew all the stuff and he told me all the stuff. And I looked at it and I was like, I don't even know what to do with this. And I wrote back to him and I said, I just need 2 sentences to plug in here that won't sound wrong. And he was like, oh, okay, then she runs the bowel, and he gave me the 2 sentences. And I was like, thank you. That's like, so there, I think there's a part of the historical research that it helps, or any research really, that when you're translating it to fiction, it's just something to remember. You don't need all of the specific details. You don't need to actually know how to do battlefield medicine, right? You just need enough to convey the feel of it to the reader, right? And so, I don't know, that helps me a little with the intimidation factor. I have a lot of intimidation factor. I actually get kind of stressed about it. So, I'm currently, like kind of thinking about this new project, and feeling like, oh my God, there's so much historical research. And a friend I was visiting a couple of weeks ago said, like, well, why don't you listen to this history podcast? It might give you some ideas. And I started listening, not expecting it to be helpful at all, because it's about the Plantagenets, and, you know, European history, whatever. But like every like 5 minutes, I found myself jotting something down, like, oh, that would be a good plot point, you know, like, and I may not use them, but it was much more accessible than my intimidation was making me feel it was going to be. So sometimes there's also like just start reading or start listening or whatever, and you may find that you know it's not as bad as you think it's going to be. You know?
Yeah, maybe it's like something that happens, whether it's something that happened to you or something that happened in history. The other thing it's giving you is that like you're not starting at a blank.
Yeah.
It makes things less intimidating for me. And so I don't know, like, what is the relationship between invention and transformation? Because people are always like, is this character this person? And I'm like, no, because I hung out with this character for 18 years. And so like actually it's like kind of like she's my own as well.
Yeah.
Like as well.
Sure.
She's like running alongside the historical figure Rajni Thiranagama. And also there are some things that happen in the narrative that didn't happen to Rajni Thiranagama. I don't know. But yeah, like I think that the blankness is just for me.
Can I ask you about the conflict? And you said earlier in the podcast that the conflict was ongoing, and it made me think about, well, you know, I went to Sri Lanka last in 2019. I took my daughter for the first time, and I wanted her to have some experience of the country. And I was a little, you know, tense, you know, when I'd been there before. It had there was still a lot of tension in the air, and I was expecting that there would be difficult political conversations at some point with somebody, right? And there just wasn't, and I was a little startled, and I wasn't seeking them out, but and some of the people I was hanging out with were younger, you know, like 30 something, late 20 something, Sinhalese Colombo writers, smart, thoughtful people. But I realized that for them, you know, the war had ended 10 years earlier when they were teenagers. And when I asked them about it, like they didn't have much of an impression of it. And it wasn't an ongoing presence in their life, right? And so, and maybe this goes to the propaganda piece that you were talking about, but maybe if you could talk a little about what you see as like when you say the conflict is ongoing, in what ways are you referring to? Does that make sense?
I guess what I mean specifically is rather than saying the conflict is ongoing, I guess I would say I don't think post-conflict. It is post-war, and that is like a language distinction that some people have specifically sought to make, that it is post-war but not post-conflict. And so you can see, for example, still, right, the policing of mourning, right? Like manifestations of the state, whether they are the police or the military, trying to prescribe to people how and if they can mourn their late loved ones who perhaps disappeared, were known to be killed, or what have you, like in relation to specifically the end of the war. There starts to be, I think the state's hesitancy has to do perhaps the debated massive number of civilian casualties associated with that aspect of the war, right? Like maybe, right? Like, because if you are allowing people to mourn those that they are casting as their loved ones and civilians, then you have to acknowledge that those people matter. And things like, you know, authority figures the end of the war this year, they're of the community for making, which is rice porridge, which was something that was served at the end of the war. And so sometimes it is served as like an anniversary thing. And people came in like, we're arresting people making rice porridge. And like grandmother's making rice porridge. I was enraged. So like that is an example. I mean, that is only one example. So I don't know, like people's expectations around differences, around language, right? Their national languages, Sinhala and Tamil, and a link language, English. Where exactly are all three deployed as they should be according to the state's own laws? Like the state is a violator of its own laws and norms. And that is certainly not true only in Sri Lanka. It is certainly true in the city where I live, Minneapolis, also known for its like outstanding authority figures. Right. So I think that's one of the ways that I would, it's like an ongoing thing. And also, yeah, I think like I was in Sri Lanka early. It's always time passed. Why am I somehow reflexively always startled last year? But yeah, you know, like you can get a university age kid who was like not that old when the war ended. And so their conscious processing of it was like very different than mine. Like my life existed along the timeline of the war in a way that theirs didn't, even though they live there and I don't. And that's weird from like a power, the stakeholder and who's not and how, right? There's space and there's also time. So you can probably find out in the diaspora like a set of people who experience the war extremely directly and who don't live in Sri Lanka anymore. And in Sri Lanka, in some places, of course, you have an emerging young generation, as you should, and they remember the war because they weren't born or what have you. So, or they were very small. And yeah, that like, and they're not wrong. Like you wouldn't be wrong to say, in some ways, those people are, of course, they're stakeholders in a way that can't be. And also, I think there's there's a long-standing frustration in Sri Lanka with acting, influencing the war in a way that people feel was presumptuous, overstepping, like damaging. Right, of course, the Tamil diaspora sent a lot of money to the Tigers. And who died as a result of that? Tamil children who lived in the country, and other like not like the of anger about that. But I do think there's also a misapprehension about the ways in which the diaspora was affected by that violence and like the fact of there being stakeholders and also notions about diaspora life being super easy and lucrative, which it had for everyone. Right, like the notion that someone who they can send you a lot of money, and there are plenty of working class Sri Lankans in the US who are struggling to make it, as there are like in so many communities. Was like a professional visa era in which like many people had professional degrees and like certainly there was like wealth and privilege there. But I think also, I don't know, like if you go to France or Germany or Canada, like you'll find like a lot of variability in terms of class, in terms of the kinds of histories that people experienced over. Were they refugees? Did they seek asylum? Was that official or unofficial? Like if you ask people, it's fascinating to me when people are kind of like, and did your parents emigrate to the US because of the war? And then sometimes they'll kind of say, no matter how, they'll say whatever they want because because like it's like the answer is more complicated. It's like, what if you came to the US and you were like going to go back and then you stayed?
Yeah.
Like would the motivations be completely clear? Like would they be certainly influenced by the war? Like, yeah. And so, but it's like it's not the same. So I don't know, there's all of this nuance in there.
Sure.
And I think like for people haven't and seen what it's like for someone to try to make a living in the US where like the cost of living is places the ease that isn't always there. I don't know.
Yeah.
I could talk to you forever. I know. I just want to note, in the interest of time, Suki has to go. She has another thing soon, so we can't keep her too long. But Ben, go ahead, finish what you were going to say.
Oh, I was just going to say that I think this, I was just going to reflect something from my own experience. I mean, it's sort of like this relates to the digging into actual history, opening up specificity and strangeness, and also to like the propagandized version of history versus the, you know what I mean? Like because I was thinking about, as you said, like wherever my um family tree, who would have, you know, essentially in the time of the Ghost and the Golem, left the Russian Empire in like 1882. It was literally like a year into the first pogroms. And, you know, I just had this generalized ahistorical sense that, like, you know, things were bad in Russia. People were always killing the Jews, and that's why we left, right? But now, the more I got into it, I was like, they were in like the north. They were in Lithuania. They were nowhere near where the pogroms were happening. And like, you know what I mean? It was sort of like, I don't know, did they? I mean, they were affected by like the May laws, which was like the government's reaction to it. But it's like how you disentangle. Like, I just had this very simplistic, childish version of like they fled from their lives from mobs, but no, there were no mobs. They maybe read the tea leaves and were like, this is not going to be economically great for us, and like anti-Semitism is rising and the government hates us, and maybe this is a good time to go. But you know, it's sort of it isn't like this kind of, you know, this sort of like the dynamism of history and how one moment was so different from another, you know, and the propagandized version is this sort of, I mean, I was raised sort of, I think, with this very thin propagandized, you know, kind of stylized version of history in which, like, once upon a time the Jews were in Israel and then they were driven away and then they suffered. Oh, whoa, we have ragged clothing and are beaten, and then they came back. I don't you know what I mean? And that elides so much specificity. And I was, you know, stunned to find out that the time I'm writing about in 1891, those are the first pogroms in Poland since like the 1600s. And even then it was more like somebody was invading Poland. Like there was basically no, you know, it was like, I don't know, it's like 1850 being totally different than 1890, and 1890 being way worse was like a radical, you know, kind of idea. And that's just sort of, I think when you start pulling at the threads, you like the propagandized version is simple, right? The propagandized version is sort of like, you know, we were suffering and this was they were oppressing us and whatever. And then like as you disentangle it, you get all this complexity. And I think that's what's so interesting about where the book ends up landing morally. We kind of talked about medicine as being an engine of the book, but the other engine that I wanted to say when we were talking earlier is journalism. And they are all there's all these trained doctors, and as you pointed out, the people doing effectively the documenting of human rights abuses are not trained journalists. But it's also a book that has all this heroic fact checking. I mean, it's like that's a part of the engine of it is this like there's the Hippocratic Oath thing of like the person in front of you is what matters, not your theoretical extrapolation of what side that's going to help. And then the other engine is like really telling the truth in specific detail and refusing to elide things into a simplistic narrative is like that's the place the characters kind of take a stand. And that's a really interesting you know, I can relate to that.
I mean, that's probably why I think it's such an important book. You know, much of the book you could say is Sri Lanka focused, but the piece about the importance of truth telling, resisting propaganda, embracing complexity and nuance, and people's real lived lives that ends up so important by the end of the book. It's a very strong argument that the book is making, and one that is, I think, I mean, clearly really politically important right now, always. you know, as we're recording this podcast in August 2024, heading into the national American election, and I'm thinking about this all the time, right? Of the how easy it is to, and I see it on my Facebook wall, I see it with my friends, smart people who just take sides and like get entrenched in their sides, and it makes it, I don't know. I think we need to work harder at embracing complexity, I guess.
And I think there's I mean, taking sides is an interesting phrase, because it's not that the book argues for a kind of sterile neutrality in which you don't act, or you think all the things are equal or whatever. It's more, it's the there's a difference between acting and taking a side in the sense of like fighting for something, and like a totalizing taking of sides where like you absolutely inhabit the position that everything that you're doing is right and everything that they're doing is wrong, and it's a silencing of internal dissent, and like that kind of totalizing taking sides is, I think, what the, you know what I mean, and one thing I think is really a moral strength of the book is that it's not written from a place of like, well, this was just dumb, right? The people who are you know, the people that the narrator is shocked and disillusioned by, you totally see how they got there, and it's not that the narrator has really a better alternative to offer them. It's not like the book does not say, well, if everyone would just calm down and like stop being worried about this, everything would be fine. Like that is definitely not the case. Like there's no you leave the book really unclear in a way whether like there's no obvious right option. It's not like they could have just like, you know, I mean, and they had a choice at every moment. Like like that's the refrain of the book, is like, we could have done this differently, but you know, you could have just not, like on some basic moral level of like, you could have helped the person standing in front of you instead of shooting them. Like it is always clear. And in a grander sense of like, should they have fought for this? You know, like, are these people fighting for nationalism and independence? Like, if they, it's not like if they would just stop, everything would be fine, right? Like in a way, the government, it starts with the government, you know, rounding up and crushing them, and you know, it's like, it's never. And I think that's a really, you said claustrophobic earlier, Marianne, and there is something claustrophobic powerfully about the choices in the book, where it's like, in the immediate, like I can just treat this patient in front of me, it's very clear. But it doesn't take refuge in being like, well, everyone would just follow this ideology, everything will be fine. You know what I mean? Including the ideology of like, quote unquote, not taking sides and being like, we'll just ignore whatever. You know, I mean, it's powerfully about how people have very limited agency, but they still have agency in each moment.
Yeah, you phrased that better than I did. So thank you. Appreciate it. And I'm going to turn it to Sagi to close us out, right? Any thoughts you have about what we were just talking about, or anything else that we didn't get
I hope
to?
you don't mind our habit of having authors on and then telling them what their book is about.
Sorry.
No, I mean, it's a tremendous privilege to be read so carefully by such smart people who are like, also to be read by like smart writers and be understood is like such a privilege. And it doesn't, you know, like, as you, I'm sure both know, like it doesn't always happen. Like you put your stuff out in the world and you're like, that was not what I meant. Like you were not reading carefully enough, right? And so like, I think I was interested in like specific details and complexity and like, for example, right, and these are some of the things that I attempted to do in that regard, also ended up having to do with plot. So just to provide a couple of examples, like there's a character in the book, Hasna, who is like a close friend of Sashi's, and she's from the Muslim community. And I think that often, like when we talk about the war, like we don't talk about its effect on the Muslim community at all. Like they're sort of like fully erased from the narrative. And both Hasna and her father like play key roles in the book. I hope that there's the sense that they're living their own interesting lives beyond like the scope of what happens to Sashi. Like I imagine them doing a lot of very specific things. There's also moments where like there was, for a while, there were like these 1983 things that would like, people would post about 1983 and they'd be like, and then Sinhalese people protected their neighbors, and I'd be like, and also Sinhalese people killed their neighbors, right? And so there was this sort of like valorizing narrative of the people who, you know, were hiding their Tamil neighbors in some room or another. And 100%, like those stories happened, they're important, they exist, and also like those were not the only stories. So like there's a moment where Sashi does turn to a Sinhalese neighbor of hers, and he's married to a Tamil person.
Yeah.
Because that also happened. I was like, oh, I'm gonna put like a ethnically mixed couple in here, and I'm gonna freaking not say anything about it at all. And like, also they were totally plausible. So
I also really like that there's the asshole neighbor across the street. There's like some noble neighbors who are helping them, and there's like, oh yeah, and the asshole neighbor literally just ratted you out. Like that's a great, like the complexity of their cul-de-sac is like just their street is like,
yeah, and I think like that happened too. And so, right, like Shahan Karunatilaka's book, The Seven Moons of Mali Almeida, like some of that is about like the lack of justice for what happened in 1983. The fact that everyone knows that this like massive, essentially state-sanctioned act of violence against a minority community happened, and that like no one was ever really prosecuted for it. Right, like the rumor, like you often will get people who will just say things like, that many people died, like move the heck on or whatever. And like there's a relatively recent editorial in a major Sri Lankan newspaper that is like unbelievably racist on this point. And I don't know, just like, so the specificity, right? Like I remember a thing I had to fact check was that someone had told me that Jaffna was bombed with human shit during the war. And I was like, that sounds just like a notch past what was plausible, but I'm Sri Lankan and I know about the government. So like, maybe that's plausible. So then I went and fact checked that, and it happened.
God.
So I was like, I'm definitely putting that in so that like someone who doesn't know that that happened has to be like, my country bombed its own people with human shit. And then like made them sound like, I don't know, it's like my analogy for this is always like, Miss Trunchbull in Matilda.
Yes.
Right. And she throws that kid by her ponytails. And then Lavender and Matilda are talking about this, and they're like, she's going to go home and tell her mom, but they're not going to believe, like she won't, or no, it's actually that she won't say a word because no one will believe that the Olympic champion of the shot put or whatever hurled a kid by her hair this far. Like the crime is so, the crimes are so outlandish. That you can sort of be like, well, that's obviously not true. And like, that's another way that like the lack of reality, like if you don't have to ask yourself which parts are true, then people can do whatever they want. And like, I don't know. So
it's almost a defense. The implausibility is like a defense against, like it will be easy to, I think that's,
all right. We're gonna we're gonna let her go because she has to go to something else. But thank you so much for being on the podcast. This was great. I'm gonna drop you a note and ask you. We didn't have time to talk about other Sri Lankan texts or resources that you'd recommend. So we'll get that from Siki and it'll be in the show notes. And
is there anything else you want to tell people where they can find you or, online or whatever?
Yeah, I am on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook, and I technically am on Blue Sky. I hardly ever use it. But yeah, I'm online. I have a website and I'm not super hard to find, and I love to hear from people. I do have a motor disability, so I'm not always the best correspondent in return, but I'm reading all of the things. I'm so grateful to have had this conversation with both of you, for both of you. Like, so I feel like now I'm like, oh, I now I want to go write, which is always like the feeling that you get after the best conversations. So I so appreciate that. Thank you so much. And Ben, congratulations on your new book. And
thank you.
I'm looking forward to reading
Likewise.
it. And I'll certainly send you some other resources, Marianne. So thank you.
Yay. All right. Thanks so much. Okay.
Hey humans, don't forget to follow, like, and subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and more so you don't miss future episodes of Mohanraj and Rosenbaum Are Humans. Leaving us a good rating also helps us reach a wider audience. If you want to reach us directly to ask questions or continue the conversation, you can email us at mrah@speclit.org. This podcast is hosted by Marianne Mohanraj and Benjamin Rosenbaum. Editing and show notes by Connor Nevitt. Music composed by Thor Bremer, and cover art by Stephanie Bailey. Thanks for tuning in to Mohanraj and Rosenbaum Are Humans.